Traditions and Encounters by McGraw Hill by Jerry H. Bentley. Chapter 12, Part 2. Development of complex societies in Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Like societies in Byzantine and the Dar al-Islam, Chinese society influenced the development of neighboring lands during the post-classical times. Chinese armies periodically invaded Korea and Vietnam, and Chinese merchants established commercial relations with Japan as well as with Korea and Vietnam. Chinese techniques of government and administration helped shape public life in all three lands, as did Chinese values and cultural traditions. By no means did these lands become absorbed into China. All maintained distinctive identities. Yet they also drew deep inspiration from Chinese examples and built societies that reflected their participation in a larger East Asian society revolving around China. Korea and Vietnam. During the Tang Dynasty, Chinese imperial armies followed in the footsteps of the Qin and Han dynasties by mounting large-scale campaigns of expansion in both Korea and Vietnam. Although the two lands responded differently to Chinese imperial expansion, both borrowed Chinese political and cultural traditions and used them in their own societies. Here's thinking about encounters. Did you want to pause? The Xia Dynasty. In the 7th century, Tang armies conquered much of Korea before the native Xia dynasty rallied. Both Tang and Xia authorities preferred to avoid a long and costly conflict, so they agreed to a political compromise. Chinese forces withdrew from Korea, and the Xia king recognized the Tang emperor as his overlord. Thus, Korea entered into a tributary relationship with China. Envoys of the Xia kings regularly delivered gifts to Chinese emperors and performed to the kowtow. But those concessions brought considerable benefits to the Koreans. In return for the recognition of Chinese supremacy, they received gifts more valuable than tribute. Chinese supremacy. In return for the recognition of Chinese supremacy, they received gifts more valuable than the tribute they delivered to China. Moreover, the tributary relationship opened the doors for Korean merchants to trade and for students to study in China. Chinese influence in Korea. Meanwhile, the tributary relationship facilitated the spread of Chinese political and cultural influences to Korea. Korean rulers began to model their court along the Chinese lines, and the Xia kings even built a new capital at Kumsong, modeled on the Tang capital at Chang'an. Korean scholars went to China to study Chinese thought and literature and took copies of Chinese writings back to Korea. Their efforts helped to build elite Korean interest in the Confucian tradition, and Chinese schools of Buddhism attracted widespread popular interest. China and Korea differed in many respects, most notably, Notably, perhaps, aristocrats and royal houses dominated Korean society much more than in China. Although Korean monarchy sponsored Chinese schools and Confucian examination system, Korea never established bureaucracy based on merit, and political initiative remained firmly in the hands of the ruling classes. Nevertheless, extensive dealings with its powerful neighbor ensured that Korea reflected the influence of Chinese political and cultural traditions. China and Vietnam. Chinese relations with Vietnam were far more tense than their relations with Korea. When Tang armies ventured into the land that Chinese called Nam Viet, They encountered spirited resistance on the part of the Viet people who had settled in the region around the Red River. Tang forces soon won control of Viet towns and cities, and they launched efforts to absorb the Viets into Chinese society. The Viets readily adopted Chinese agricultural methods and irrigation systems, as well as Chinese Chinese society. The Viets readily adopted Chinese agricultural methods and irrigation systems, as well as Chinese schools and administrative techniques like their Korean counterparts. Viet elites studied Confucian texts and took examinations based on a Chinese style education, and Viet traders marketed their wares in China. Vietnamese authorities even entered into tributary relationships with Chinese court. Yet the Viets resented the Chinese efforts to dominate them, and they mounted a series of revolts against Tang authorities. As the Tang dynasty fell during the early 10th century, the Viets won their independence and successfully resisted later Chinese efforts at imperial expansion to the south. Like Korea, Vietnam differed from China in many ways. Although Buddhism won a large popular following, many Vietnamese retained their indigenous religions in preference to Chinese cultural traditions. Women played a much more prominent role in Vietnamese society and economy than did their Chinese counterparts. Southeast Asian women had dominated local and regional markets for centuries, and they participated actively in business ventures closed to women in the more rigidly patriarchal society of China. Nevertheless, Chinese traditions found a place in the southern land. Indeed, like Korea, Vietnam absorbed political and cultural influence from China and reflected the development of larger East Asian society centered on China. Here's the Vietnamese dancer. Early Japan. Chinese armies never invaded Japan, but Chinese traditions deeply influenced early Japanese political and cultural development. The earliest inhabitants of Japan were nomadic peoples from Northeast Asia. They migrated to Japan, perhaps across land bridges that formed during Ice Age about 200,000 years ago. The language, material culture, and religion derived from their parent society in Northeast Asia. Later, migrants who arrived in several waves from the Korean peninsula introduced cultivation of rice, bronze, and iron metallurgy, and horses into Japan. As the population of the Japanese islands grew and built a settled agricultural society, small states dominated by aristocratic clans emerged by the middle of the first millennium CE. Several dozen states ruled small regions. Nara, Japan. The establishment of the powerful Sui and Tang dynasties in China had repercussions in Japan, where they suggested the value of centralized imperial government. One of the aristocratic clans in Japan insisted on its precedence over the others, although in fact it had never wielded effectively authority outside its own territory in central Japan. Nevertheless, inspired by the Tang example, this clan claimed imperial authority and introduced a series of reforms designed to centralize Japanese politics. The imperial house established a court modeled on that of Tang, instituted a Chinese-style bureaucracy, implemented an equal field system, provided official support for Confucianism and Buddhism, and in the year 710 moved to a new capital city at Nara, near modern-day Kyoto. That was a replica of the Tang and capital at Chang'an. Never was Chinese influence more prominent in Japan than during the Nara period 710 to 794 CE. Yet Japan did not lose its distinctive characteristics. While adopting Confucian and Buddhist traditions from China, for example, the Japanese continue to observe the rites of Shinto, their indigenous religion, which revolved around the veneration of ancestors and a host of nature spirits and deities. Japanese society reflected the influence of Chinese tradition but still developed along its own lines. Heian Japan. The experience of the Heian Kamakura and Muromachi periods clearly illustrate the distinctiveness of Japanese society. In 794, the Emperor of Japan transferred his court from Nara to a newly constructed capital at nearby Heian, modern Kyoto. During the next 4 centuries, Heian became the seat of a refined and sophisticated society that drew inspiration from China, but also elaborated distinctively Japanese political and cultural traditions. Under the Heian, 794 to 1185 CE, local rulers on the island of Honshu mostly recognized the emperor as Japan's supreme political authority. Unlike their Chinese counterparts, however, Japanese emperors rarely ruled but rather served as ceremonial figureheads and symbols of authority. Effective power lay in the hands of Fujiwara family, an aristocratic clan that controlled affairs from behind the throne through its influence over the imperial house and manipulation of its members. Indeed, since the Heian period, the Japanese political order has almost continuously featured a split between a publicly recognized imperial authority and a separate agent of effective rule. This pattern helps to account for the remarkable longevity of the Japanese imperial house. Because emperors have not ruled, they have not been subject to deposition during times of turmoil. The cultural development of the Heian Japan also reflected both the influence of Chinese traditions and the elaboration of peculiarly Japanese ways. Most literature imitated Chinese models and indeed was written in the Chinese language. Boys and young men who received a formal education in Heian Japan learned Chinese, read the classic works of China, and wrote in the foreign tongue. Officials at court conducted business and kept records in Chinese and literature. Literary figures wrote histories and treatises in the style popular in China. Even Japanese writing reflected Chinese influence. Since scholars borrowed many Chinese characters and used them to represent Japanese words, they also adapted some Chinese characters into Japanese syllabic script, in which symbols represent whole syllables rather than a single sound, as in an alphabetic script. The Tale of Genji. Because Japanese women rarely received a formal Chinese-style education, in Heian times, aristocratic women made the most notable contributions to literature in the Japanese language. Of the many literary works that have survived from that era, none reflects Heian court life better than the Tale of Genji, composed by Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting at the Heian court, who wrote in Japanese syllabic script rather than Chinese characters. This sophisticated work relates to the experiences of a fictitious imperial prince named Genji, living amid living amid gardens and palaces. Genji and his friends devoted themselves to the cultivation of an ultra refined lifestyle, and they became adept at mixing subtle perfumes, composing splendid verses in fine calligraphic hand and wooing sophisticated women. The tale of Genji also offered a meditation on the passing of time and the sorrows that time brings to sensitive beings. As Genji and his friends age, they reflect on past joys and relationships no longer recoverable. Their thoughts suffuse the tale of Genji with a melancholy spirit that presents a subtle contrast to the elegant atmosphere of their surroundings. At the Heian court, because of her limited command of Chinese, Lady Murasaki created one of the most remarkable literary works in the Japanese language. The decline of Heian Japan. In the late 11th century, changes in the countryside brought an end to the Heian court. The equal field system gradually fell into disuse, and aristocratic clans accumulated most of the island's lands into vast estates. Two clans in particular, the Taira and the Minamoto, overshadowed the others. During the mid-12th century, the two engaged in outright war, and in 1185 the Minamoto emerged victorious. Like the Fujiwara family, the Minamoto did not seek to abolish imperial authority in Japan, but rather claimed to rule the land in the name of the emperor. They installed the clan leader as shogun, as military governor who ruled in place of the emperor, and established the seat of their government at Kamakura, near modern Tokyo, while the imperial court remained at Kyoto. For most of the next 4 centuries, one branch or another of the Minamoto clan dominated political life in Japan. Let me go ahead and... This is the samurai. Oh, that's so cool. Medieval Japan. Historians refer to the Kamakura and Muramochi periods as Japan's medieval period, a middle-aged era falling between the age of Chinese influence and court domination of political life in Japan as represented by the Nara and Heian periods and the modern age. Inaugurated by the Tokugawa dynasty in the 16th century, when a centralized government unified and ruled all of Japan. During this middle era, the Japanese society and culture took an increasingly distinctive characteristic: political decentralization. In the Kamakura 1185 to 1333 CE and Muromachi 1336 to 1573 CE periods, Japanese society grew ever more distinctive. Indeed, Japan developed a decentralized political order in which provincial lords wielded effective power and authority in local regions where they controlled land and economic affairs. As these lords and their clans vied for power and authority in the countryside, they found little use for the Chinese-style bureaucracy that Nara and Heian rulers had instituted in Japan, and still less use for the elaborate protocol and refined conduct that prevailed at the courts. In place of etiquette and courtesy, they valued military talent and discipline. The mounted warrior, the samurai, thus came to play the most distinctive role in Japanese political and military affairs. The samurai. The samurai were professional warriors, specialists in the use of force and the arts of fighting. They served the provincial lords of Japan, who relied on the samurai both to enforce their authority in their own territories and to extend their clans to other lands. In return for those police and military services, the lords supported the samurai from the agricultural surplus and labor services of peasants working under their jurisdiction, freed of obligation to feed, clothe, and house themselves and their families. Samurai devoted themselves to hunting, riding, archery, and martial arts. Thus, although it had taken its original inspiration from the Tang Empire in China, the Japanese political order developed along lines different from those of the Middle Kingdom. Yet Japan clearly had a place in the larger East Asian society centered on China. Japan borrowed from China, among other things, Confucian values, Buddhist religion, a system of writing, and the ideal of centralized imperial rule. Though somewhat suppressed during later periods, these elements of Chinese society not only survived in Japan, but also decisively influenced Japanese development over the long term. This is the end of Chapter 12, Part 2.